If it's Wednesday, President-elect Trump staffs up with new picks to fill key economic, health, and foreign policy roles as senior members of the Harris campaign speak out in depth for the first time on what went wrong for the vice president in the election. Plus, the Israel-Hezbollah ceasefire takes effect and appears to hold for now. But will it last as the diplomatic focus returns to Gaza and brokering a deal with Hamas? And a barrage of recent food recalls and outbreaks of foodborne illnesses are raising concerns around food safety and the U.S. agencies that are about to be shaken up by the new administration. Hi there, welcome to Meet the Press Now. I'm Ryan Nobles in Washington, wishing you a day of easy travel if you're heading out on the roads or at the airport on the day before Thanksgiving. This holiday week, President-elect Donald Trump is filling the seats at the table of his new administration, which is bringing his agenda for the next 4 years into shape. His latest picks include Jay Bhattacharya as NIH director. He was an outspoken critic of COVID lockdowns back in 2020. Keith Kellogg, a retired general and close ally, as a special envoy for Ukraine and Russia. And Kevin Hassett as the director of the National Economic Council. He's a veteran of the first Trump administration, as well as Jamieson Green as the U.S. trade representative. He's a disciple of Trump's first trade representative, Robert Lighthizer. Now, these certainly aren't household names, but their selections largely show that Mr. Trump is preparing to dive headfirst on what he ran on, specifically upending the health establishment, bringing an end to the war in Ukraine, and wielding tariffs as a weapon. But the same could be said about the border. Incoming border czar Tom Homan joined Texas Governor Greg Abbott yesterday at the southern border, and he later did a little chest thumping about the president-elect's plans.
I'm happy that we finally got a president. President Trump's going to come in January. Like the governor says, we're not waiting till January. We're already talking. We're already planning. We're going to put a plan in place and secure this nation at the highest level it's ever seen. We're going to finish Trump's work. That is why there needs to be a mass deportation. We have a mass number of people, millions of people who will get a final order and be ordered removed. If we don't do it, what is the option? Let them stay? Because if you let them stay, you'll never fix the border.
Now, that pledge of mass deportation has mayors from Denver to Tucson saying they will push back if the methods become too intense. But Homan is preemptively digging in, saying deportation will happen with or without cooperation.
You could not help us. That's fine. You should get the hell out of the way then, because we're going to do the job. President Trump has said public safety threats and national security threats will be the priority right out of the gate. And I can't believe there's any elected official that doesn't want public safety threats out of their communities. Their number one responsibility is protecting the communities. So if they're not going to do it, we'll do it for them.
As for Democrats, they are spending this holiday season trying to figure out how they lost the presidential popular vote for the first time in nearly a generation. On the Pod Save America podcast, Harris senior advisor Stephanie Cutter deflected some of the criticism that Harris failed to differentiate herself enough from President Biden.
She felt like she was part of the administration, so why should she look back and cherry pick some things that she would have done differently when she was part of it? And she had tremendous loyalty to President Biden. Imagine if we said, well, we would have taken this approach on the border. Imagine the round of stories coming out after that of people saying, well, she never said that in a meeting, or what meeting when she said this, or I remember when she did that. And it wasn't going to give us what we needed because it wouldn't be a clean break. It would be, days upon days in a limited time window that we had of dealing of who, what, when, where. So the best we could do, and the most that she felt comfortable with, was saying, look, vice presidents never break with their presidents. The only time in recent memories when Pence broke with Trump after Trump stormed the Capitol.
All right, let's bring in some of my NBC News family. Garrett Hake is on set with me, although notably did not bring a side dish to pass. He's covering the Trump transition. Also with me is Mike Memoli. He's promised to bring me back something Thanksgiving-related from Nantucket. He's there covering the aftermath of the Harris campaign. So, Garrett, let's start with you. What can you tell us about these latest rounds of appointments, and what do they tell us about Trump's agenda?
Well, the Keith Kellogg pick is the most interesting one to me because it says Trump is serious about his plans to try to end the Ukraine war and end it fast. Kellogg is the author of a research paper on exactly how you could do that in an America First framework. He wants to see concessions from Ukraine and essentially, tell the Russians, we're going to arm Ukraine to the teeth until you guys get out of there. But basically after the fact, that this is a stalemate and it's got to end. So I'm watching that. The health picks are interesting to me, but mostly it's kind of an elections have consequences set of selections here where you've got a bunch of COVID contrarians to a certain extent who have ridden the wave of blowback to the COVID lockdowns into these positions in the federal government, folks who are anti-masking, anti-vaccine mandates. That's now par for the course among conservatives. And so, I think there could be some shock in the medical establishment and among some elected Democrats when their confirmation hearings come up. I don't expect them to have any problems with the Republican-controlled Senate.
Yeah, and let's talk about one of them, Jay Bhattacharya. He's going to lead the NIH. He was a big advocate of herd immunity, which there is still quite a bit of controversy around in the medical community. Isn't it important to remember that Donald Trump was the president during a large part of these decisions that were made on lockdowns, on mask mandates, on the installation of the vaccine and the requirements around the vaccine? How is he taking an about face on this, and what does this appointment tell us about that?
Well, I think Donald Trump rode popular opinion within the Republican Party to a different place than where he started. And he's tried to have it both ways, especially early on in the primary season. You'll remember he tried to run on the idea that he was the father of the vaccine, but then sort of tried to have it that he was also opposed to vaccine mandates. He looked at what happened down in Florida, where Ron DeSantis rode his own opposition to COVID mandates into being a national figure who, at least for a moment, thought he had a chance of becoming the Republican presidential nominee. So Trump has embraced the kind of contrarian views on COVID now. Bhattacharya, as you pointed out, kind of became famous for his opposition on COVID. But he's also a serious academic, and he works on issues like, how do you link physician performance with pay for hospitals and doctors? How do you deal with an aging population and keeping them healthy? So I think there's a broader set of issues here at play, but there are certainly these kind of anti-COVID orthodoxy celebrities on the right who are now going to get their moment in the sun.
And we played some of Tom Homan and this kind of very tough talk that he's making about how they're going to plan to implement this mass deportation policy. Is this bluster, or are they going to make good on this promise?
Not from Homan. I mean, he's pretty serious about this. Look, I think there's a limit to what Trump can do, especially early. I mean, they could change the posture at ICE and at CBP, and I think they can give local law enforcement a sort of a morale boost if they want to kind of dig in on immigration matters. But there's only so much they can do without more money. Ultimately, they're going to need more money for detention facilities and planes and agents to get up to the scale and size they want on deportations. But Homan's tough talk also has a sort of an actual policy reason behind it. They are hoping, and he is hoping, that we see self-deportations start to happen even now from folks who don't want to screw around with potentially getting kicked out of the country and facing a 20-year ban. They go home now. They lower that risk to themselves. Homan wants to be bad cop, if you will, on that issue and see what they can get done again before Trump even takes office.
Okay. All right, Garrett, thank you. We appreciate it. Let's go to Nantucket now, Mike, and let's talk about kind of the fallout of the Harris campaign and this podcast heard around the world. The top campaign brass talked to Pod Save America about the campaign, and they largely deflected blame for the loss. I mean, how would you characterize the tone of what we heard from them?
Well, I think the two main takeaways, there was a lot of discussion about various specific and general trends that we saw over the course of the campaign. But every response that we basically got back from the senior leadership of the Harris campaign was that the national political environment stunk, to use a slightly more TV-friendly term than what was said on the show. And secondly, that they just didn't have enough time to get the vice president introduced to voters in the way that you would typically try to do for a major party nomination. I think the longest period of conversation on this podcast was about something that a lot of people have attributed to the vice president's failing, not just in those battleground states, but especially the even steeper drop-off we saw across the country. And that was the lack of a response to the ads we saw from the Trump campaign, in which the vice president, in her own words, talks about taxpayers paying for surgery for people transitioning, especially people in prisons. And so that was something that the campaign said that they tested relentlessly how to respond, whether to respond. And ultimately, they decided that there was no gain in any of the measures that they tried to find to respond to it aggressively. They said, again, with more time, perhaps that this was something that would not have worked. The other thing that I found really interesting was that they essentially, in talking about the national political environment being so sour, and some of that is pointed in the direction of President Biden and just having very low approval ratings, was that the fact that she came so close in these battleground states, but then saw a significant drop-off in states like New Jersey, Illinois, California, is in some ways proves their point that in the places where they could intensely focus all their energy and resources, they were able to get close to a draw at least, whereas the more broader electorate that wasn't seeing their messaging, that wasn't seeing the vice president or Tim Walz or any of the other campaign surrogates, was more reflecting just the general national mood. So what does that mean for the party going forward? I thought one of the other more interesting points that was made by Jen O'Malley Dillon, the campaign chairman, was that they shouldn't necessarily overread the results of the election because, as she put it, Donald Trump is a very unique phenomenon in the Republican Party, and a lot of things that worked well for him wouldn't necessarily translate to other Republicans. So there are things that she says the party has been doing, especially as it relates to intense organizing, the field, the money that they put into organizing across the battleground states, that needs to continue. And also, interestingly, outreach to Republicans and outreach to moderate voters. She said that's going to be essential for the party in especially Senate races that will be coming up, that we'll be talking about before we know it in 2026.
And Mike, thank you so much for that. We appreciate it. Happy Thanksgiving. Enjoy your trip to Nantucket. Joining me now for some more insight is former Alabama Democratic Senator Doug Jones and former North Carolina Republican Governor Pat McCrory. Thank you guys both for being here on the day before a holiday. I really appreciate it. Doug, I want to start with you. And about that conversation related to Harris breaking with Biden. What did you think of that answer from Stephanie Cutter? Is that criticism valid, or is this just Monday morning quarterbacking at this point?
You know, look, I think it's a little bit of both. I think one of the things that folks should have planned on, I mean, breaking with Biden was going to be the obvious question. And I understand the reluctance to break, and I certainly understand the loyalty to the president, and she was there. But I think that could have been a little bit better honed. It should have been the first question: why are you running for president, and what would you do differently? Should have been the things that in the first 24 hours they honed in pretty quickly, and I don't think that they did that appropriately. And I also think that she could have probably deflected a little bit, and with the right preparation, I think she could have talked about the fact that in hindsight, it's easy to look. But the fact is, there were a lot of things going on. There's a lot of things that they could have done. In hindsight, sure, they could have done things different. On the border, for instance, why depend on that damn Congress to do something when you could do it on your own? They gave Congress too much credit. So there's a lot of things, I think, partly Monday morning quarterback, a lot of things that people are looking at, pointing fingers.
So, Pat, Democrats are going to pick up some seats in the House after all this is said and done. They held on to some seats in the Senate that you wouldn't think they would have held on to given the results of the presidential election. Trump is going to end up shy of the 50% margin nationally on the popular vote. It's going to end up being less than a 2 percentage point win for him in that regard. Should he and other Republicans be using the word mandate? Should that be the kind of their governing principle going into this Congress, or should they be looking for areas of compromise?
It's already too late. It's been branded as a landslide long earlier, and that brand is going to stick. They exceeded their expectations. As you know, a lot of times in politics, the senator knows this, that when you exceed the expectations, the victory is exaggerated, and he's going to take advantage of that. You know, one thing that we haven't talked about in the past is I think the president, Trump, owes Greg Abbott a lot of credit for this. When he made the very tough and controversial policy to move some of the illegal immigrants up to the northern urban centers, democratically controlled, I think that had a huge impact on public opinion on illegal immigration, made that even more of a national issue. And I think that was huge. And Kennedy was a much bigger factor than I think the media gives him credit for. And I think Trump understands that by appointing him DHS secretary. And I think that was partly due to some of the COVID things that happened. For example, North Carolina during COVID, we closed down the bars, but didn't close down the breweries and said that was science. It made no sense. It was lobbying in our state capitals on, certain rules we had for big department stores, but not for small department stores, for churches and schools, but not for basketball games or protests. And I think there was hangover from COVID. And the last thing is the assassination attempt, I think had a much bigger factor on this election than people realize. When he stood up after being shot and yelled, "Fight, fight, fight," I don't care who the Democrats made their nominee. It's tough to go against that. We've never seen anything like that in U.S. history. And I think we kind of moved on from the assassination attempt, not realizing the long-term impact of that.
All right, let's go back to your first point about immigration and now the implementation of these promises that the new now president-elect made during the campaign. And I want to start with you on this, Doug. He has this plan for mass deportations across the country. We've seen some Democratic executives in cities and states saying they're going to push back if the administration crosses the line or requires local law enforcement to help them. And this could turn into a standoff between municipalities and the federal government. How do you think this ends?
Look, I think we're a long way from trying to figure out how it ends. I think this is going to start slower than Tom Homan thinks it's going to start. They're talking about national security interests. They're talking about the most dangerous criminals. You're not talking about 11 million people. You're talking about a handful of people. What I think is going to happen is that the Trump administration is going to come in. They're going to do a lot of things for show right now, and I don't mean that in a bad way. They're going to do things to show that they are deporting people. But then they're going to run into the reality, I think, has been said on this show, of money and resources and how you logistically go about doing that. And that will trail off. I don't know if the mass deportations will ever get to the 11 million people. I think what is important to remember is exactly what we heard just a few moments ago, and that is they're banking on scaring the hell out of people to have them deport themselves and hopefully be able to get back into this country later. We'll see some things, but it's not going to be the mass deportation that everybody has been promised, at least initially.
So, Pat, I want you to try and separate yourself from the policy and more talk about this from your perch as a former governor and a former mayor. How would you have taken it if a czar of any kind came and said to you as a mayor, this is what we're going to do, you either get on board or get out of the way?
Well, the thing is, as a mayor and a governor, I swore to uphold the Constitution, not only of my state, but also of the federal government. That was part of my oath in office. So there are certain federal laws on the book that I assumed as governor I would have to go along with and help. And in fact, in North Carolina, they just passed a state law in making the sheriffs cooperate with federal officials in some of the enforcement of illegal immigration. So there are going to be some turf battles, as there always been, between the state, local, and federal governments, because there's a fine line. There are gray areas in constitutional authority.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. All right, Doug, I want to put up something that our friend Chuck Todd wrote in his new column. It reads, we as a nation have taken this concept of the ends justify the means and essentially turned the country's North Star of whatever it takes for our own success, not just whatever it takes for our own survival. The more we succumb to the idea that politics is such a brutal game that only the amoral or immoral need apply, we will cede our higher ground and won't like the reactionary world that develops around us. He's arguing that the norms of character in politics have taken a backseat to just zero-sum politics, whatever it takes to win. Do you agree with that? And are you concerned about the direction politics is taking in this country?
Oh, absolutely. I've been saying something similar for a long, long time. Character doesn't matter anymore. There used to be everything used to be character counts, and it doesn't really seem to count anymore. It's all about the politics. It's all about an agenda. And that's not for everybody. But I think the internet has hurt in that. I think the media has fostered that to some extent. And quite frankly, a winner take all. We have moved in this country in politics from just partisanship to a culture of contempt, to a culture of hate, us versus them, good versus evil. And I think that's kind of toxic for the country. Hopefully we can move past that. But I agree with Chuck. We've got to start having our politicians, like Governor McCrory. He was a good example, somebody that folks could disagree with, but look up to as a public servant. There are few public servants today and more politicians, and we need to get back to public service.
Well, Doug and Pat, it's nice to have a Republican and a Democrat on the show and have a very cordial and nice conversation, even if you might not agree on every single thing. I'm thankful for you both. Have a very nice holiday. We appreciate it. Now turning to some unsettling developments and a reminder of just how fraught our political climate is right now. Today, the Trump transition team reported that several of President-elect Trump's picks for top jobs have been targeted with bomb and swatting threats. The office of Congresswoman Elise Stefanik, Trump's pick for UN secretary, UN ambassador, confirms that she was one of the targets. Lee Zeldin, Trump's pick for the EPA administrator, says that he was targeted. So does former Congressman Matt Gaetz, who was Trump's pick for attorney general until he withdrew his name last week. 3 senior law enforcement officials briefed on the incident tell NBC News that none of the threats were credible. The White House says that President Biden has been briefed and that he and his administration unequivocally condemn threats of political violence. It also comes as an Arizona man was charged with threatening to kill Donald Trump. Investigators say he posted videos nearly every day accusing the president-elect and his family of kidnapping and sex trafficking his children. Coming up, could one ceasefire lead to another? What's next for the Middle East as the Israel-Hezbollah truce begins while Israel's war in Gaza rages on? We're on the ground in Beirut next. Plus, NBC investigates an unexpected trend in abortion rates in the wake of the Dobbs decision. They've gone up. That reporting and what it could mean for the future of reproductive rights is straight ahead. You're watching Meet the Press now. Welcome back. The U.S. brokered ceasefire between Israel and Hezbollah went into effect overnight with thousands of displaced Lebanese civilians returning to their homes for the first time in months. The fighting between Israel and Hezbollah, which began soon after the October 7th Hamas attack, displaced over 1 million Lebanese civilians. But today you can see here the bumper-to-bumper lines of cars as families return to the areas of southern Lebanon, celebrating the end of hostilities. At the same time, Lebanon's army has also started moving south. Under the deal, the country's armed forces will now be charged with establishing a buffer zone in the border region between Israel and Lebanon. According to a senior administration officials, negotiations between Israel and Lebanon reached their most intense points before the elections. The incoming Trump administration, meanwhile, trying to take some credit with President-elect Trump, his pick for the national security advisor, writing on X, quote, "Everyone is coming to the table because of President Trump. His resounding victory sent a clear message to the rest of the world that chaos won't be tolerated." Joining me now is NBC News international correspondent Matt Bradley. He's in Beirut. Matt, what's the mood like in Beirut today as people return to southern Lebanon? Are those families returning? What are they returning home to?
Yeah, they're returning home to, in many cases, nothing or just what's left of their damaged homes and businesses. People that we spoke with said that, this is going to be, they really have no other place to go. And in fact, the government is urging them to go return to their homes because what we've been seeing here for the past really 2 months has been a humanitarian crisis, or at least nearing that. There's been more than 1 million people who've been displaced, and it was the speed of that displacement and the dysfunction of this government, which is practically a failed state and is now in the 5th year, this country, of a financial crisis. They were struggling to keep up. So this is going to be a huge relief to people of Lebanon, not just in the south and in the south of the city of Beirut, but also throughout the country, because they were handling the burden of this displacement crisis. So now, the Israelis are actually encouraging those Lebanese who live near the border, the southern Lebanese border with Israel, not to return home. But we're already seeing, as you've seen on your screens, so many people thronging to get back to their homes, which in many cases they're going to be very disappointed, have found that they have been leveled by 2 months of relentless Israeli shelling.
And obviously, these folks must feel that the deal is going to hold up, Matt, if they decided to make the trek back, especially given the fact that their homes may be in disrepair. Is there broad confidence that this is actually a deal that will sustain?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question, Ryan, and it's one that is hard to answer. It really depends, as in any question in Lebanon, it depends on who you ask, because there's so many different sects and different political allegiances and opinions here. We spoke with one young man just about an hour ago who said that this means victory, that Hezbollah won, the Israelis can't maintain their fight, and that that's the reason why this truce was inked with the help of the Americans and the French. And he was saying basically he has full confidence that because Hezbollah won against the Israelis, that this is going to stand. But as you can see, when it comes to that question you've just answered, or you've just asked, the answer is being voted by people's feet. They are moving back. They are tired of being displaced. They're tired of the instability of war. And for many of them, this is just such a relief that they're not even waiting to see whether or not the truce holds. They're just so anxious to get back home.
And President Biden has said that his administration is going to continue to pursue negotiations with Hamas. Is there a sense that those negotiations could pick back up now?
Yeah, that's a really good question again, Ryan, and it's a hard one to answer. And your question is revealing because, remember, it was only a couple of months ago that the administration was putting the Gaza deal before the Lebanon deal. It was seen that if the Gaza deal could go through, that they could come to some sort of agreement between Hezbollah and the Israelis. Now it's being seen as the reverse, that maybe this deal means that there could be some hope for a deal between Hamas and the Israelis. But I have to tell you, so far, and we're still not even 24 hours into this ceasefire here in Lebanon, it doesn't look as though there are any indications that this successful diplomacy north of Israel's border could spill over into a negotiated deal in the southern part of the country in Gaza with Hamas, which is a war that has been raging now far more than what we've been seeing here in Lebanon for more than a year. Ryan?
Okay. All right, Matt Bradley, thank you for that. Let me now bring in Firas Maqsad, a senior fellow at the Middle East Institute. Firas, what's your reaction to this ceasefire? Were you surprised that Israel and Lebanon were able to reach an agreement?
Hello, Ryan. Good to be with you. No, I'm not surprised. I may be a bit relieved given the human toll that this has taken on both sides of the border, but mostly on the Lebanese side of the border. But I'm not surprised because when it comes to Israel, the Israeli defense forces have really kind of hit a threshold of diminishing returns. They pretty much hit all the valuable targets that they could have in Lebanon, destroyed a lot of the southern suburbs in South Lebanon, really Hezbollah's strongholds. And there was really more risk than reward moving forward. And Hezbollah is very clearly on its back foot. I mean, some people call this a deal, even a victory. I heard Matt Bradley talking from Lebanon about some Lebanese wanting, some Hezbollah supporters wanting to refer to this as victory. I see it as nothing short of a capitulation. Hezbollah and Iran in Lebanon were dealt a very hard blow, and we're looking for the exit. So the signs were all there that this ceasefire was going to come into place. Now, the big question is whether it lasts or not.
And we see pictures of the Lebanese army that's been sent in to secure this buffer zone that's going to be a key part of the deal. Obviously, Hezbollah is the major fighting force in that region. Does the Lebanese army have enough strength to secure this buffer zone to help sustain this ceasefire?
Excellent question, Ryan. I think it's a question of two things. One is capabilities, and two is political will. It does not have the capabilities. Hezbollah is, in fact, much more powerful than the state and its armed forces. And so a good component of this deal deals with providing military assistance to the LAF, the Lebanese armed forces, whether it's the U.S., France, or some of the others in the donor community. But then there's the question of political will. And every time I put that question to the LAF command, I'm told, we have a government in place that recognizes Hezbollah and legitimizes it as a resistance force against Israel. So it really comes down to having to deal with the tough politics in Beirut. Unless the international community works with the Lebanese to end the void in the presidency, Lebanon hasn't had a president for 2 years because the parties can't agree on one. Unless you have a sovereign-minded president elected and a government that does not sanction Hezbollah's weapons, the LAF, the Lebanese Armed Forces, is not going to have the political directive to tackle Hezbollah and its weapons.
I want to play for you something that National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan said today. Take a listen.
There have been ongoing indirect contacts through the mediators with Hamas in recent weeks. We believe that now that we have a ceasefire in Lebanon, the pressure will only grow on Hamas to reach a deal.
Do you agree? Does the deal in Lebanon put pressure on Hamas to come to the negotiating table?
Yeah, I mean, I think Jake makes a good point. Listen, from the day after October 7th, all these various proxies of Iran and quote-unquote resistance organizations across the region, they declared their strategy of being one of the unity of fronts. So really encircling Israel with a ring of fire sponsored by Iran. Hezbollah in Lebanon being the crown jewel, Hamas obviously in Gaza, the Houthis in Yemen, the various Iran-sponsored militias from Syria and Iraq, all of them. And so what really happened with this ceasefire, which is crucial, it is that it forced Hezbollah's hand to step away from attacking Israel, step away from that unity of front strategy. And it does put a lot of more pressure on Hamas. Now, whether that means that Hamas would finally walk in the door, sign on to agreement, which in their view would be nothing short of capitulation, that's a whole different question. That's an extra step forward. But no doubt it does pile the pressure on Hamas.
And maybe expand on that point you were making about Iran. I mean, how does this affect them? Does the fact that one of its proxies were forced to the negotiating table and to capitulate, as you say, signal a weakness within their regime?
Ryan, it's huge. Iran is on its back foot. We ought to remember that Iran and Israel exchanged direct blows for the first time twice, at least in the past year since the October 7th attack. That is momentous. Iran has historically had a preference for indirect warfare with Israel, using these various proxies because it understands that it has much to lose in a direct confrontation. The Israeli military is much more capable than the Iranian military. And many in Washington and in the region right now are dealing with the question of whether this might be an opportune time to attack Iran's nuclear program. Because their air defenses is down after the last Israeli attack, because Hezbollah and Hamas, essentially the regime's first line of defense against Israel, are also down and on their back foot. And so there are many questions being asked whether the months ahead provide an opportunity for Bibi Netanyahu in Israel and perhaps the Trump administration to do something against the Iranian challenge in the region.
All right, terrific insight. Faraz Miqsad, thank you so much for being here. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Up next, a deep dive into why abortion rates went up even after the Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade, which paved the way for a rollback of abortion rights nationwide. You're watching Meet the Press now. Welcome back. More than 2 years after the Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade, data now shows that abortion rates in the United States actually went up. More than 1 million abortions were recorded in the U.S. last year, according to the Guttmacher Institute, a research group supporting abortion access. That number is the highest in a decade, and it comes despite more than a dozen states implementing bans on the procedure since the Dobbs decision. Joining me now is Aria Bendix, a health reporter for NBC News. Aria, walk us through this report. It does seem somewhat counterintuitive as more than a dozen states implemented total bans in the wake of the Dobbs decision. What is driving this uptick?
You're right. It does feel counterintuitive, Ryan. So in the immediate aftermath of the Dobbs decision, we did see abortions go down a bit. A CDC report actually came out today finding a total abortions in the U.S. fell 2% from 2021 to 2022. But then something changed last year. Since the Dobbs decision, 8 states have actually passed what we call shield laws, and those allow providers in the states where abortion is legal to actually prescribe abortion pills in states where they're banned. We also know that abortion funds and provider networks really received a large influx of donations after Dobbs, and they used those donations to open up more clinics and to help fund out-of-state travel for abortions. So those efforts combined have really allowed abortions to increase despite state-level restrictions.
And are you finding that the increase is evenly dispersed, both geographically and socioeconomically?
For the most part, yes. I mean, abortion pills are a really key part of this story, and they don't come with the same barriers as going to an in-person clinic for a procedural abortion. They're easier to find, and ordering them online means you don't have to travel to get them. You don't have to take time off work or arrange for childcare. And many telemedicine providers actually price the pills on a sliding scale, meaning you pay what you can. So it matters much less now where you live and how much money you make, at least when it comes to medication abortion.
And so this could be the next fight, right? You mentioned the influence of medication abortion and maintaining access to the practice. Earlier this year, we saw a case about mifepristone that reached the Supreme Court, but the court dismissed it, but it was based on standing, not necessarily on the merits of the case. Should we expect to see more legal challenges to abortion pill access?
We should, and in fact, we already are. So in October, the attorneys general of Idaho, Kansas, and Missouri, they filed a very similar lawsuit to the one you just mentioned in the same Texas court where that original mifepristone case was filed. And the particular judge there, who's a Trump appointee, ruled in favor of the plaintiffs last time. It's reasonable to expect he might do so again. So the question then becomes, would the FDA under Trump appeal that decision and fight for mifepristone access? Hard to say. At the same time, the Center for Reproductive Rights has filed a lawsuit in Virginia seeking to actually expand access to mifepristone even further. And those two lawsuits could potentially come into conflict with each other depending on the outcomes. So lots to watch for in the coming months, Ryan.
Yeah, especially because Trump has not said specifically that he's opposed to the abortion pill. He said that this is just a decision that should be left up to the states. So if there's federal action related to it, that will tell us a lot about where he stands. Aria, Bendix, thank you so much for being here. We appreciate it. And after the break, some food for thought on the future of the FDA and a flurry of recent food recalls that are raising safety concerns as millions of Americans gather around their Thanksgiving tables. You're watching Meet the Press now. Welcome back. Ahead of what is perhaps the biggest eating-focused holiday of the year, food recalls have been grabbing Americans' attention, with recent recalls ranging from carrots to poultry to frozen waffles over concerns from foodborne illnesses like E. coli, salmonella, and listeria. It comes after a Gallup poll shows that trust in the government's ability to ensure food safety has reached a record low. And as the FDA, which regulates more than 3/4 of the country's food supply, is preparing for a shakeup with the incoming Trump administration. President-elect Trump announced his picks to lead the FDA, who will ultimately report up to Mr. Trump's pick for Secretary of Health and Human Services, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. Now, Kennedy's faced some criticism for his vaccine skepticism, but his pledges on food safety have resonated with some lawmakers, potentially earning him some support from Democrats. Joining me now is Christina Jewett, who covers the FDA for the New York Times. Also with me, Susan Mayne, the former director of the FDA's Center for Food and Safety and Applied Nutrition, and currently a professor at Yale's School of Public Health. Christina, let's start with you. We mentioned just some of the current food recalls in effect, and it feels like it's been like an uptick for months. Is that just a perception, or are we actually seeing a rise in foodborne illnesses?
You know, it's really more of a perception. The numbers don't really bear out a big increase, but when you have these really iconic names like Boar's Head, with Listeria, and McDonald's with E. coli, that's when people do start to, notice these outbreaks. And so the numbers do seem like they're adding up. And you also have a better ability to detect things. And you also have the USDA going out to take a look at ready-to-eat meat facilities to make sure things are shipshape. And so you got a couple more big recalls out of that as well.
So what do consumers need to know as they're heading into this holiday season, Christina?
I'm cooking for Thanksgiving myself, and cooking is considered a kill step. And so as you go through that process, you're really making your food quite safe. Some of the more concerning, products are the cold cuts that you put right on your sandwich. It goes from the plant onto your plate. Same thing with a sliced onion, right from, the processing facility where those were cut up in Colorado onto the McDonald's quarter pounders. So, as I think about my, recipes for Thanksgiving, things are pretty heavily cooked. So I'm not too concerned about that meal tomorrow. But yeah, in general, in the food safety system, when you have items that are not processed in that way, not cooked at home, you do have higher risk.
So, Susan, I'm picked up on what Christina said about the fact that the FDA is just finding out before the fact that some of this food may not be safe, and therefore that's what's leading to these recalls. How should people be thinking about these food recalls? Is it a sign that things are getting worse, or is it a sign that the system's actually functioning correctly and catching these things before they actually become a threat?
Yeah, so let's talk a little bit about the outbreaks and the recalls. The purpose of the outbreak investigations is to identify an outbreak as soon as possible and to keep the number of cases, the number of people who've gotten sick as small as possible. and then interview those people and figure out what may have been causing those illnesses. And what we've seen in recent years is our ability to identify even those outbreaks has gone up dramatically just in the last decade. And the number of people who are sickened in these outbreaks has gone down. So, for example, if you think about something like one of the big outbreaks we've been focused in on in the news, the carrot outbreak, for example, we had 39 people who were sickened in that outbreak. Tragically, there was a death, but 39 people. And in the past, outbreaks were much larger than this, and our ability to detect them was less. So that's a key piece of it. So we detect the outbreak, we identify the food, and then get that message out to retailers to get the food off the shelves and to consumers so they can get it out of their kitchens. So that's how the food safety system is working, to try to get earlier and earlier and earlier to protect consumers from unsafe food. And in some cases, products are being recalled before any illnesses. For example, if they've been tested for microbial contamination and found to harbor bacteria, those are being recalled as well. A number of recalls are also based upon undeclared allergens, pulling those off the shelves before they cause illness. So that's where we are with our U.S. food safety system. So I agree with Christina that families should feel confident when they sit down to the table for their Thanksgiving meal. They should feel confident in the safety of the food.
So, Christina, this all, of course, comes as we're getting our first look at who's going to be in charge of the FDA in the new Trump administration. Tell us more about McCrory. Sorry.
Well, he is sort of a noted contrarian over the years, and that contrarian streak, came to the fore over a decade ago when he sort of had the courage to speak out about errors, medical errors in the healthcare system, hospitals sort of operating on the wrong side of the patient. And he, on sort of the right arm instead of the left arm. So he spoke up about that, and he went around and helped hospitals fix those problems. More recently, the contrarian streak has sort of cut into the issues related to the COVID pandemic with some criticism of lockdowns and also a prediction about herd immunity that was a bit bold and didn't quite bear out and made some waves. But he is seen as someone who's an experienced researcher, somewhat of a institutional person with some criticism, some pointed criticisms of the system. So it'll be really interesting to see what he does.
Susan, you served in multiple administrations. How much can a change in an administration impact the FDA's ability to regulate our food supply?
Well, the folks at the FDA are there working day in and day out to protect our food safety system. They're also working on nutrition issues and have taken numerous policy initiatives to help improve the healthfulness of our food supply. And that was true across all three administrations that I worked in, the Obama administration, the Trump administration, and the Biden administration. So those folks are working hard to execute that work. Obviously, the FDA commissioner has a big role to play in terms of what work is prioritized. So certain things will make their way through the system to the HHS for clearance and then to the White House and ultimately move forward as new policies. The administration's priorities will really help determine which things are going to move most aggressively. And the statements from RFK Jr. about trying to address the epidemic of diet-related chronic disease, that's exactly what FDA wants to do, is to really address the epidemic of diet-related chronic disease. So those policies are areas that are very well aligned with the mission of the FDA on the food side of the house.
But how do we square, Susan, kind of the way that Donald Trump talks about deregulating things? He's talked about deregulating so many different industries, but then on the same token, he's installed someone at HHS like RFK Jr. who has talked about installing regulations to try and deal with some of these issues that you're talking about. Is it that he's kind of picking and choosing the things that he wants to regulate, or how should we interpret that?
Well, much of the work of the FDA will not require new regulations, just simply executing the ones that already exist to help protect our food supply. It'll be interesting to see if they are contemplating any new ones, any new changes in regulations and authorities to address some of the issues of chemicals in the food supply. But short of that, FDA has the authorities it needs to do the labeling, to inform consumers, to execute the food safety mission. But the administration may be looking for new authorities to help move this more rapidly along to address this epidemic of diet-related chronic disease and make America healthy again. So it'll be interesting to see how that particular dynamic plays out in this administration.
All right, Christina, before you go, what's the #1 side dish you've got planned for tomorrow?
I am a fan of my homemade cranberry sauce with a little bit of orange zest.
So. Ooh, that is controversial, though, right? I mean, I'm a cranberry in the can guy, so I might be a little skeptical at your dinner table. I'm not going to lie.
Well, we'll have to agree to disagree on that, Ryan.
All right, Christina Jewett, Susan Mayne, thank you both for being here. Have a wonderful Thanksgiving. We appreciate it.
All right, take care.
Still to come, the key ballot initiatives that passed and failed this election and what it means for the future of ranked choice voting, psychedelic mushrooms, minimum wage hikes, and more. You're watching Meet the Press Now. Welcome back. Republican candidates fared well on the ballot in this election, and so did conservative causes. Voters in 3 states, Arizona, California, and Colorado, all approved measures to toughen sentencing on crimes, while voters in 3 states, Florida, North Dakota, and South Dakota, rejected efforts to legalize marijuana. Voters in Massachusetts also rejected a proposal to legalize certain psychedelic drugs, and California voters rejected a ballot measure to increase the state's minimum wage. It's the first time a ballot measure in any state that proposed raising the minimum wage has failed since 1996. I'm joined by Reed Wilson. He is the founder and editor of Pluribus News, which covers state legislatures and state-level policy across the country. As a fan of state legislatures, I'm always excited to talk to you, Reed. Thank you for being here.
I appreciate it.
So what was your biggest surprise this election cycle?
Well, I thought the California initiative rejecting a minimum wage increase, even though it would have been to $18, which would have been the highest in the nation on a statewide level, still surprising because, as you say, it's been almost 3 decades since a minimum wage increase lost. Several other wage increases passed across the country. I expected California to pass it, and they didn't.
Well, it was not the only place where some of these liberal causes had a tough night. Marijuana legalization in particular, it seemed like the trend line was heading in the other direction, and all of a sudden it ran into a brick wall. Do you think it's going to be back on the ballot in some of these states in 2026 and 28?
It certainly will be. Let's take a look at Florida, a state where more than 50% of state voters approved the measure to legalize marijuana. However, a Florida constitutional amendment requires 60% to actually pass. There's a big marijuana company down there called Trulieve that spent more than $100 million trying to pass this. You can imagine that a legal recreational market would be fantastic for their bottom line. I think they're going to be back to try again. It's interesting, though, we're getting to the point now in which there aren't enough states that allow the ballot initiative for marijuana legalization to pass. So supporters of legal marijuana are going to have to start looking to state legislatures. And you'd think that a politician wouldn't want to touch legalizing marijuana, but it's happened in a few states, in New Jersey, in New York, New Hampshire, where Republicans control the state legislature. They keep trying to legalize marijuana. There's a disagreement about how to do so among Republicans. But you're going to start seeing state legislatures turning towards legalization simply because supporters don't have anywhere else to go where they can get measures on the ballot.
So it was also a good year for conservative issues. More states are going to have measures on tougher prison sentences. Is this another trend that we could see happening in future elections?
I think it's an interesting backlash to about a decade of liberalization of criminal justice laws. We saw some real anger in a lot of states in the midterms and in this presidential election over crime, increased crime generally, retail theft specifically. People think that is the reason that Democrats lost control of the House in New York in the midterm elections in 2022. They lost a bunch of seats, and Governor Kathy Hochul almost lost her re-election because of anger over crime. Now we're seeing some voter backlash to that. You pointed out Colorado and Arizona. Colorado, a relatively liberal state. Arizona, a relatively swing conservative state. But California undid a ballot measure that they passed a decade ago that liberalized some criminal justice laws. They reimposed some of those penalties. So I think there's a little bit of a balancing there after states went a little farther on the, call it the, I don't want to say soft on crime, but sort of a criminal evolution over the last decade.
All right, let's talk about what happened in Missouri, because on the surface, this doesn't seem like it should have played out the way it did. Deep red Missouri, they voted to protect abortion rights and to require paid sick leave. These would seem like they're liberal issues. How are they winning in a state like Missouri?
Well, so we saw pro-abortion measures passing in just about every state where they were on the ballot, including some very conservative states like Missouri. What I think this proves is that voters don't adhere to a party orthodoxy as much as, say, a politician does. There's a huge number of voters who just voted to elect California Senator-elect Adam Schiff, for example, who also voted to toughen criminal penalties and voted against raising the minimum wage. On the other hand, there are a whole bunch of Missouri voters who voted for Senator Josh Hawley, who just won a second term, but also voted for a measure to protect abortion rights. So I think, voters don't hew to the same sort of orthodoxy that a politician might. They can hold multiple views in their heads at once.
Okay, we're going to have to leave it there, Reed. Thank you. What are you most looking forward to tomorrow at the Thanksgiving table?
Seeing a good friend of mine who just got over a long illness.
Well, that's great.
There we go.
Well, great. Happy Thanksgiving, Reed. Thank you for being here. We appreciate it. I'll be back on Friday. I'm going to not be here tomorrow, if that's all right with you. We'll have more Meet the Press now. I'll be with my family tomorrow. But all of us at NBC News wish you and yours a very happy Thanksgiving. The news continues now with Yasmin Vasugian in for Hallie Jackson right now.
Thanks for watching. Stay updated about breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or follow us on social media.